So this section, we are going to see the revival of trade. After the Crusades, and really during the Crusades, it inspires many people to go out and to find new things, bring them back to Europe, and that's what's going to get us here to this point for Roman numeral 4. So as we see trade begin to come back to Europe, here's how it happens. There are a number of different trade routes that could be taken, all of which were having their basis coming from the Far East, moving westward. So we could go through the southern route, which was the typical route that was used in the day, where they would come through the water, which this route doesn't show it very well on the screen, but they would come down through the ocean, Arabian Sea, up through the Red Sea, through the Nile River, and then up into the Mediterranean. That would be the southern route. I'll move my podium here so you can see that better. So oftentimes it would come from this location through the Arabian Sea, up the Red Sea, through the Nile, into the Mediterranean, then it would get its way to Europe. The central route would be a combination of both land and sea, where they would take a shortcut here through the Persian Gulf, and then cross over land here through modern-day Iraq and Syria, and then get to the Mediterranean from that location. And then the third route was the Silk Road, or the northern route. And this was all by land, where they would come directly from Beijing and come across the mountains and end up in Constantinople. And then from Constantinople, they would distribute that throughout the rest of Europe. So when many of these traders begin using any one of these three routes, depending upon which one was going to be most convenient and fastest for them, Italy here becomes the main controller of Mediterranean trade, and a lot of that had to do with the success of Venice conquering Constantinople, thanks Crusaders. And so most of the trade came through Italy, and then Italy would redistribute the goods throughout Europe, thus making Italy a whole lot of money in the process. So we get to talking about the Renaissance. And as we talk about the revival, a lot of that comes out of Italy because of this. If this would have happened somewhere else, there's a good chance that another country would have come to the forefront there. Now, in order for this to be successful, you're not going to be able to rely upon barter quite as much as what we once did. So we're going to have to find ways to come up with a good money system.
Are you choking?
So the barter system here was not going to be able to meet the demands of the trade route. Imagine walking into Walmart with a chicken, having to exchange your chicken for whatever you get at Walmart. Barter system does not work. Right. Or I want that new kayak, and I have 7 chickens I would like to offer for that new kayak. It just doesn't work. So because of that, we start to see more bankers and the production of coins. So many of these feudal lords begin minting their own coins. Many times it was very crudely stamped out of precious metals. And these coins would only be good within their feudal land. So in order to go from one little town or manor to another one, you'd have to exchange those coins because nobody else is going to take those coins at another location. The very first and the, I don't remember if this is going to come up here on the screen. It does. The florin was the was the initial one made by the city of Florence, and this was a gold coin. And this became one of the most common coins used in this particular part of the world. Sometimes they were mixed metals. They weren't always pure gold.
Okay, I was thinking, like, wouldn't that be like just like buy a bunch of those and then just melt them down?
And so typically they would be worth. You've heard the phrase "worth its weight in gold."
Oh yeah.
So
okay.
whatever weight it was, and some of these money changers, they would try to rip people off by adding other metals to it to make it heavier. So anyway, the values would vary between different locations, and so the florin became one of the most consistent, made by the city of Florence in Italy. And these money changers are people who knew the value of the coin. Gavin?
I was doing what I was supposed to be doing on my computer, but I just want to tell everyone from 2 to 6 you can get free taco at Taco Bell.
Thank you for that public service now. Yeah.
When?
It's for the 2 to 6 for the MLB. I'm sorry.
That's.
I'm not.
If you want to know more, see Gavin right after class. He'll fill you in on the details.
Gavin, I'm seeing you after class.
Okay. So these money changers, they would provide a lot of services that we might see at a common bank today. So when people would be traveling and they would want to exchange their money, they'd go to this money changer. The money changer would exchange the value, and they would know how much the value differs from one manner to another. Very similar if you travel out of the country and you go to another part of the world and they don't take American currency, you're going to have to exchange that money. And you're going to have to trust and know that somebody's going to do that in a correct way. We get the term bank from an Italian word banca, which means bench, because many of these bankers, they just sat at a bench outside of town and they waited for travelers to come in. And you'd find a person sitting on the bench and you would talk to them and you'd exchange your money. That's where we get our modern term bank from. So as these guys exchanged your money and as they gave you advice on the money of the day, they would offer you certain resources if you want to take advantage of it. One of those was called a letter of credit. Letter of credit works very similar to what we would think of as a modern day check. If you didn't want to carry all that money with you while you're traveling, you've all heard the story of Robin Hood. Okay, maybe you're afraid of Robin Hood out there. You could go to a money changer and you could turn in your coins. He would write you a letter of credit saying that you are good for 100 coins of silver, or whatever it is you have. You get to the new city, a new village, and you go to that money changer and you'd hand him that. And as long as they recognized each other, then he would give you the coins at that new place. And it was a much safer way of traveling.
The one dude's like, here's a check.
Well,
and
these
then you get to the other place,
these-
it's like, oh, I don't know that guy.
these money changers were typically part of a network, or they call it a guild. They call it a guild. So they all understood how the system worked, and so therefore, typically they would honor it.
They have their codes and everything.
Well, not necessarily that way, but it was kind of an honor system. Now, one of the practices that became popular here was the practice of usury. Now, the church, this is an old English term that is actually mentioned in the Bible. This is the practice of charging somebody for borrowing money. Like interest. Yeah, interest would be a more common term today. The reason I use the word usury is because that's the old English term. That's also the word that many of the Catholic Church members looked at in the Bible and they said, wait a second, the Bible says we shouldn't charge usury. But yet these money changers were charging interest when they would loan money to people, and they condemned them and they said, well, you are not following the Bible. So according to the Catholic Church, this was sinful to charge interest. And these people were not, these money changers were evil. Now, when the Bible talks about that, the Bible is speaking of a whole separate situation. They're completely taken out of context. I don't have time to explain all that right now, but if you want to talk one-on-one, we can clarify that for you. But eventually this practice becomes very commonplace. And people kind of get over it, and they end up making an acceptable practice of charging interest, like we would understand today. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, they're doing a job, they're making a living, so you should be able to charge them for that. Now, we start to see towns grow and get bigger. We have people that are called townsmen, and they are the ones that are going to leave the feudal system. They're going to live in the city. Hesitate to use the word city, but we'll use it for right now. And these are the ones that have been given certain privileges by the feudal lord to come in and to live in this town. Now, they had to have a charter because they were technically still on the land owned by the feudal lord. And he had to give them permission to form their own little town.
So is that where the whole like Charter for America thing came from?
Kind of.
Wait, so
Yeah.
like all the people who worked under like a lord or something could like live in like this small village thing kind of?
Not all of them, but he would grant some of them. And I'm going to explain a little bit of how you got to that point here in just a moment. So you can get to the status known as free status if you lived in the town for 1 year plus 1 day.
Oh, wow.
So you had to
That
make
extra day.
you had to make a commitment here of living there for more than a year. And if you could find a way to sustain yourself, then you could be a free man and be lifted of all the Lord's responsibilities, all the Lord's commitment that you had made to him. Now,
Would you lose your village?
well, here's why. Okay, so you don't like to be a farmer, which I know that's hard for you to imagine. But you don't like to be a farmer. You would rather be a baker, and you'd rather take those farm goods, you'd rather bake these wonderful creations and sell them.
Yes.
Because of the practice of money changers and the reemergence of coins and currency, people could go into an exclusive business and just bake. Or they could be a blacksmith, or they could be a shoemaker. So the lord of the land saw value in this because he then could
Bye high.
buy that stuff, or he could trade with them, and he could have somebody that does a really good job with it. So that's why he endorsed it, and he thought this might be a good idea. Yeah.
So like at this time, is like the life expectancy kind of going up some? Because like it seems like
A
how this-
little.
That means they need more people.
Yeah.
More people be here at the town. The others be out in the field still.
A little bit, yes. Life expectancy. Now, land is starting to get more crowded. Doesn't necessarily mean that they live longer.
Oh.
There are more people, but not necessarily living long life.
What?
Now, if you reach that point, you could be exempt from your obligations on the manor because you are working in the town, and the town is going to benefit, ultimately, the landowner, because all these new people are coming to the town, they're going to buy stuff, and the landowner gets to tax the people in the town. So it ultimately benefits the lord of the land. So the town itself, they owed a major tax to the lord of the land instead of individuals. So they had to collectively put all their stuff together, and he would collect that tax a couple times a year. So that provided a little advantage for them. When it came to discipline issues, they executed town justice.
I just thought you said you
S-
executed.
Yeah, let's listen to the whole statement. So when somebody would violate the rules of the town or violate the rules of the manor, they would be brought before their peers, and the people of the town would judge whether or not that person was guilty and what their sentence ought to be.
You should do that.
Wait, like the whole.
That's
town,
called a
or, like,
jury.
you mean like a jury.
No, like at school.
So it depended how large the town was, but typically it would be a selection of your peers like a jury.
Okay.
Wouldn't necessarily be the entire
whole
town.
would be like a mob.
No. But this eliminated, took the pressure off of the lord of the land to be able to make all those decisions, and now the people themselves were beginning the process of self-government. Yes?
Is that also so they couldn't just blame it on the Lord?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that way they kept themselves accountable. Now, if all these people were working and following the laws and they were doing what they're supposed to be doing, then they could have commercial privileges, which meant that they were able to freely buy and sell their goods. So if you're a baker and you want to make bread and you want to make pies, you can do that as long as you're following all the rules of the town, you're following the rules of the Lord of the land, and you are paying your taxes. You can sell it to whomever you want. And as we see the revival of trade and more people are coming through the village, you're going to want to sell as much as you can because then you can make more money. This is the beginning of stepping out of the feudal system and stepping into the more modern age of Europe, is when we see the creation of these towns. And the lords of the land, the feudal lords, allow this to happen. So, we're going to break at this point. We are going to take a quiz on Friday.